Just before we start this week's episode, we want to take a moment to let you know that this episode contains stories of homophobia, hate messages, and death threats, which some listeners might find upsetting. If you are affected by any of the issues in this podcast, please check the show notes for where you can seek advice and take care of yourself.
Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte, an award-winning podcast where we explore the topics that matter most in business. I'm George Parrott, and this is episode number 52, where we ask, does being you get easier with age?
Therefore, it's a kind of repeated coming out. Like you constantly have to make the decision, am I going to tell this person? How are they going to react? Is that going to be okay? What consequences might there be?
Everything's just louder than maybe it was, when we didn't have the internet. I think that's just the world we live in now.
That really is the only way that we change this kind of thing.
But you talk about the trauma you've grown up with there, and I think we're sort of missing, this conversation is far too deep for a soundbite.
Hello, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. As a reminder, you can find all of our previous episodes on our website or wherever you get your podcasts from, and we're also on YouTube. And I'm delighted to be joined by my partner in crime, Ethan. How are you, Ethan?
Yeah, good. Thanks, George. It's good to be back again. I think last time we were talking to Alan Jope from the Unilever CEO, so totally different topic this week.
That's right. Yeah, we're getting in a little bit more personal this week. We're really exploring what it's like to be you in the workplace and how we can encourage everyone to be themselves. But either we can talk about this for hours, I'm sure, but I think we probably need some experts in the studio to talk us through it.
We do, and we are joined by a professional this week, so slightly more pressure. We are joined by James Barr, who is the presenter of the UK's biggest LGBTQ plus podcast, a gay and a non-gay, as well as being a radio presenter and a stand-up comic. Welcome, James.
Hi, babes.
Hi, James.
And we're also joined by Mag Scott, who is a CFO advisory partner here at Deloitte, and is also a sponsor partner for Deloitte's LGBTQ plus network, Proud. Welcome, Mags.
Hello.
And I think to start with this week, we thought we'd do something a little different and throw a little bit of a curveball question, and which hopefully won't spark a bit of an existential crisis. So apologies in advance.
This is me you're talking to.
Fair enough. I think any question gets me slightly existential, so that's why I like to be the host. But yeah, the question that I was going to ask you was, who are you and when did you figure that out? And have you figured it out?
Well, I identify as gay. Gosh, when did I figure that out? I grew up in a small town in the Northeast in the 80s and early 90s. And I've got to say, I didn't knowingly know any gay people. This was hard to imagine it now, but this was the world before the internet and certainly before social media. And I had to Google this morning, but there was also not really any representation of LGBT people on TV either. The first lesbian kiss on TV in the UK in Brookside was 1994. And I was already 16 at that point. But the reason for saying all of that is that I think I was, 17 or 18 before I kind of realised what had been going on all of this time. Mm-hmm. I certainly knew at school that I was different, but because I had absolutely no reference point, I kind of didn't know different how. Yeah. So that is me, and I guess that's quite late.
Yeah.
It's quite a difficult question, isn't it, really, Mags? I don't really like it, because I've sort of sat here now thinking, well, I'm a lot of different things. I'm a dad, I'm on a business podcast wearing shorts, I'm obviously gay, but I'm also a bit of an introvert, extrovert. I mean, there's a lot of different answers to a question like, who are you? I'm myself.
I think that's probably the best sort of answer.
Yeah, I guess so. I think I am myself. Yeah, I don't really care what people think of me anymore. Yeah. Like if I offend you, I'm not that bothered. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm just myself.
I mean, I think that's great because that's really empowering. Because I would say, like, I'm not gay, but I would say I'm still finding myself. Like I wouldn't say I'm necessarily 100% know who myself is still. So I think it's amazing that you kind of got that
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I'm like, wow, did I just say that or did I just do that? But it's still me, so I just have to own it and move forwards, right?
Amazing. And James and Max, that's really helpful just to sort of set the scene a little bit. But James, you work on a very successful podcast series, and it'd be great to hear a little bit more about that. And as part of that, you've obviously had a lot of conversations around what it's like to be you, be yourself, and to understand where you are in this world, or where one is in this world. What have you learned from those conversations?
Yeah, I think it's definitely helped. I mean, a gay and a non-gay is what it says it is. It's me, a gay, and a straight guy, a non-gay. And we sat down because his girlfriend thought it would be funny. We recorded it, and it taught me a lot about the differences and the huge gaping hole between gay people, queer people, and straight people. But it's also taught me that we're not really that different in a way. So I think our podcast has taught me a lot about myself and about others, and it's also allowed me to be less angry about straight people, I guess. So you won't be getting too hard a time today if you are both straight, but I don't want to guess. It has taught me a lot.
Yeah, that's good. And Mags, you mentioned the famous Brookside scene, and I did a bit of research as well. I think the first gay men kissing on screen was 1989, which again, this doesn't seem that long ago. I'd be fascinated to hear about what you think something like James's podcast would do to help people try and understand where they are in this world and where they sit in society.
I just think if I compare now to then, it's not just podcasts. It is TV, it is radio, it is books, it is, for all of us working in organisations, there is just so much more representation now than there was then. I think, yes, it would have helped me figure out that part of me earlier. I think it probably also comes with a lot of downsides. We might get into this, but I had a very happy childhood, despite not figuring out who I was until much later. And I kind of worry now that not just from an LGBT perspective, but the pressures that social media and the internet put on kids generally, I didn't have. And so I can kind of, I can see the pros and cons to that sort of almost constant representation and constant imagery about what you need to live up to, or, what you should be doing, what you should be feeling. Generally, I would say the representation that we have now is a huge, huge benefit. But, I think it comes with some downsides too.
Absolutely. And I think, you touched on it there, Mags. There's so many other things happening just right now for young people to think about when we're against a backdrop of a cost of living crisis with post-pandemic. There's all sorts of other sort of social dynamic challenges there to consider. And I guess the thought is that hopefully, in terms of understanding, who you are, that might be a bit better now than what it was 20, 30 years ago. So what do you think about that, James?
I'm intrigued by that, Mags. I think it is a lot easier to be yourself now, but I do think there's also a lot more noise from people that don't want you to be yourself. Everything's just louder than maybe it was, when we didn't have the internet. I think that's just the world we live in now. So it's a difficult question to answer because we don't know what the world then would have been like. And without the noise we've got, would we have the rights we have now? Because, we're able to protest in so many different ways, be a lot louder and get our message across better. So I think it's just a bit this and that. There's no real way of knowing whether it was easier to be yourself, to be queer in the early noughties before the internet, because we didn't have our rights then. So maybe the internet helped us get our rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And as you both touched on, there's been huge strides forward, but I know, Mags, that you've done some work with Just Like Us, and they've had some findings that there's still a huge proportion of young people that, particularly if you're from a kind of unsupported background or you've had a particularly tough time at school, that they don't feel open to be themselves. They're worried about making the next step in their life. Can you maybe talk about some of the work that you've done with them and why you think that it is still so difficult for these young people?
On the second part of that question, kind of gave that quite a lot of thought ahead of today in terms of my own experience. But let me answer the first bit first. So Just Like Us are one of Deloitte's national charity partners. They're a brilliant small charity, and the main thing they do is help schools to be more supportive of their LGBT students by providing an inclusive environment. So that helps teachers with materials as to, you know, how to address those topics, how to promote allyship, how to help parents. They also get what they call ambassadors, who are 18 to 25-year-old, typically ex-students, to go back to their own schools and talk about their own experiences. Another example of something that absolutely did not exist when I was at school and probably would have been life-changing, mind-blowing. So I think they're a brilliant charity, and we support them in lots of different ways. To the second part of your question, the reason that I kind of have, and I still kind of don't quite know where I am on this. Like, I would say I had a very, very supportive family life when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think about going to university and when I think about starting work at Deloitte, despite knowing I was gay, I did not come out at all. And, you know, to James's point about it being easier now, absolutely it is. And maybe we'll talk later about kind of business and what the firm has done to be far more inclusive than it used to be. But the bit that it sort of made me think about is, what does that do to you as a person to have lived a big chunk of your life not being open about who you are?
Yeah.
And I sort of partly came to the conclusion that doesn't just mean that you are perhaps not as close to people, you don't form as good relationships with people because they don't really know who you are and you can't really be open. But I actually think it also, just in terms of, for me anyway, I still think it has had lasting effects in terms of my confidence. Not so much in terms of openness, but I do think it changes you as a person to have had to constantly censor yourself or worry about the next question you're going to be asked. And I also thought in advance of today, well, why was I so averse to people at university knowing that I was gay, people at Deloitte knowing I was gay? And actually, I think a lot of it was my own prejudice, actually, and maybe a kind of a degree of shame about it, just because of how I was brought up, when I was brought up, and the total lack of understanding of what it even meant to be gay. But to your point, James, in terms of, you know, your understanding of the difference between gay and straight people, I think just because I didn't even know myself what it really meant, I think that kind of changed me as a person, and I probably still haven't worked through all of that.
Yeah, we did a podcast around how you better amplify underrepresented voices, and one of our guests was Tolu, who you might know, who director in Deloitte, and she was talking about how she's from quite a strict black British Nigerian family, and she kind of almost became two people, her home self and then her social self, and then when she started work, she kind of had a decision about whether to almost create a third self or try and...
What does that do to your brain to have to keep all of those plates spinning?
This is really interesting, Mags. I think we'll definitely explore a little bit more on that. But even, we've got research which has just come out. It's part of our Inclusion at Work survey. It's a big global survey we've run for the last couple of years. And I think even now it shows that only 52% of LGBTQ plus workers are comfortable being out in the workplace. So, which is, just shows there's still an awful lot of work to do, really, and it goes into some various barriers there. But it sounds like, by definition of this week's question, which is, does being you get easier with age? It sounds like that sort of acceptance for you personally has sort of happened as you progressed through your career.
I mean, I was really interested in what, James, you said before, which is you just don't care anymore what people think about you.
Well, I mean, that's not entirely true, obviously. I suppose when asked the question, who are you? I don't really care. Like, and I am myself, and I'm unashamedly myself. But you talk about the trauma you've grown up with there, and I think we're sort of missing. This conversation is far too deep for a soundbite. I think regardless of when, I think the question is wrong. Actually, the question is, does it get easier to be you with age? The answer, I think, is no. But I also think the question is more, is it hard to be you in general? And yes, it is, because we live in a world where straight people and white people are more important than everybody else. And so it's very difficult to fit in with that. Plus, if you're queer and you're born into a straight family, which obviously you would be, I would imagine, on the most part, you don't have any points of reference. And sure, you might have Heartstopper on Netflix, but really, is that enough? Not really. It's a good start, but it's not. You had a kiss on Brookside, but the entire world is straight. So you have no frame of reference. You feel like a complete outsider, and that's how you start your life. So you're not going to be able to know who you are until you start doing work on yourself. That's a lot to deal with. That's not fair.
Yeah. And James, Mags talks about this sort of perception that she had in her experience about perhaps, I don't know, discrimination about were she to come out. Is that something that you recognise in the conversations that you have?
Yes.
But also, how do we
happens every day.
How can we work together to sort of prevent that from happening?
I mean, you can't. Like, thanks for asking. But that's not. I don't know. I don't see an end to that. I don't see an end to that. Every day I wake up and I get a message on Instagram saying, "Kill yourself," or "You're going to hell. How does it feel that you're going to live here for 50 years and then you'll burn for eternity?" And
again, I guess that touches to the point of that too much noise almost, and having.
Yeah, it's just constant. Yeah. I mean, I find it hilarious now. I'm writing a stand-up show all about it. I can't wait. But my God, it's ridiculous. So yeah, there's a lot of discrimination, and I don't think it's possible to put a stop to that. But it is possible to strengthen yourself and your friends around you, and that's why it's amazing when companies support LGBTQ plus people or minorities in general, because it just proves that we do have a support network around us and that we are valid.
Yeah, but I think even that's a great point. Like, even the question kind of, can you tell us about a time when you were discriminated against, kind of speaks to the fact that maybe there's a perception, particularly if you're straight, that it has got easier to be gay, and it's got a lot less common to be openly discriminated against. But obviously, your lived experiences, that's not the case.
You're a voice for your community just by walking down the street holding hands with a girlfriend. That is something I can't do with a boyfriend because I'm scared.
Yeah.
So it's just not fair.
And we've spoken about Just Like Us, but you also do a lot of work with young people's charities.
Yes, Pride.
Would you be able to talk a bit about kind of your experience of that, how important these things are?
I think Student Pride is one of the most important prides in the country, because often when you leave school and you head to uni, it's when you're leaving home for the first time.
Yeah.
So you have, for the first time in your life, an opportunity to create your network with people that are similar to you. You find a chosen family, and Student Pride amplifies that, celebrates that, and brings lots of young people together. And for a lot of people, the first time really that they've had a chance to be with other queer people in such a big environment, a big safe space. And it isn't just a celebration or a place to get drunk. It's a lot more than that. It's a community. There's a lot of different companies outreaching, and a lot of important queer people talking about the different experiences that bring us together.
And Mags, you sort of touched on kind of the role business has around this. So it'd be good to expand on that a little bit if you can.
Well, if I talk about business first in respect of their own employees, because businesses have a much broader role in society now than just the people that work for them. But on the employees front, I mean, right, James and my job couldn't be more different, I think, because you are exposed to all of these people who think they can say whatever they want on social media and there aren't any consequences, which, and LGBTQ people are not the only targets of that by any means, but that's maybe one of the downsides that I talked about earlier in terms of the kind of the coverage and the kind of omnipresence of lots of these topics on social media. But in terms of my experience at Deloitte, I joined in 2000, so nearly 23 years, and it's, I suppose, interesting in a way to have been with one organisation over that period of time, over which there has been huge change in the space. And, you know, to James's points, we are nowhere near there, but there has been progress. You know, my personal story is that I joined our Manchester office straight from university. I look back and I think, my goodness, I was incredibly lucky, because there were lots of people at work who were supportive, but there were two people in particular, one of whom was our talent partner, Sharon Thorne. She went on to become talent partner for the UK and set up all of our diversity networks, which when I joined the firm, we didn't have at all. The other was Will Smith, who I think was a senior manager when I joined the firm, openly gay man, openly gay at work. And I look back and I think it's people like that, and those two in particular, that made me feel that if I told somebody at work or I came out to a client, someone was going to have my back. Mm-hmm. If someone had a problem with it, they would be there for me, and it wasn't going to affect my career or my progression or any of that. And, you know, when we talk about, well, what has business done and what can business do, those visible role models in Will's case, and in Sharon's case, those senior allies are just so incredibly important. Like the difference that makes to a graduate joining the firm, to see people like that. You know, if I think, well, what if I joined a different office that didn't have people like that? I mean, it would have been such a different experience for me. And to your question to James before about the, like, do you worry about it every day? So again, in my job, I typically only really deal with professional people, so I'm not at the leading edge like James is. But I still have to make a decision every single day about whether I'm going to come out. You know, it's to a greater or lesser extent, depending on how you choose to present, it is a difference that it is possible to hide. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it's a kind of repeated coming out. Like you constantly have to make the decision, am I going to tell this person? How are they going to react? Is that going to be okay? What consequences might there be? You know, I tell everybody now, because I think in my role, I meet new clients all of the time. And I just make the decision to tell them pretty early. Like, I don't open with it. That would be weird. But I make the decision to tell them really early, because if you don't, then, I don't know, a month down the line, and you tell them then, you know, that can be weird. That can be a bit kind of like, why did you seemingly kind of hide this thing from me? But even for someone as I am now, who doesn't worry, to your point, James, I don't really worry about telling someone that. But it's still a decision I have to make. And I make it pretty quickly now. But
I think as well, though, even if you don't worry about it, it's still in there, isn't it?
That's what I mean.
It's still affecting your subconscious. And it's still, it's like a bump in the road before you continue with the rest of your day.
I mean, I don't, in the way that the two of you might, unthinkingly say, my wife and I went to wherever at the weekend. Yeah. The bump in the road is spot on.
Did you know at Deloitte we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme? Like Loaf Catering, part of Now Group in Northern Ireland, they support people with learning difficulties and autism into jobs with a future. If you're based in Belfast, you can now order Loaf's delicious food to go. If you're further away, just visit loafcatering.com, where you'll find beautiful mugs handmade by Loaf's in-house potter, just like the ones we have here on the green room table. Now, back to our topic of the day.
It touched on that broader topic, which is how do we create a safe environment for young people to be comfortable with who they are in society as they try and figure out all of these other challenges. So how do we do that? How do we foster that inclusive environment more broadly as a society?
We're lucky that just like us and other charities are stepping in to help with that. I think LGBTQ plus inclusive education is super important and roots out bullying right at the start of someone's life. That is super important. But really it's also our allies and that is, I think that's one of the most important things.
Yeah.
It's straight people just stepping up, isn't it?
I mean, I think the point about education is so important. And again, you know, it is human nature to react badly to any sort of otherness. You know, people who are, we are a tribal species, and there is something very deep-rooted about things that are different and that you don't understand. And until more people are more educated, people are going to react in that way. And I do think, to James's point, that's why charities that are stepping into a void a bit in terms of public policy to do that kind of thing at a grassroots level, at a school level, providing materials, providing support to educators, that really is the only way that we change this kind of thing. I mean, it's got to start with education, I think.
Yeah. I think your response to George's question was quite, well, it reminded me of, we did an episode around what it's like to be black in Britain. And one of our guests, it was fairly close to in the wake of the kind of George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. And she kind of said, like, to be honest, I'm quite tired of white people asking me this, and actually, like, why do we have to answer that for you? Kind of like, you're the ones being racist. You need to solve this problem. So I don't know if that resonates with you at all, but I think, yeah, from a kind of ally perspective, maybe that's something that me and George need to think about as well, the answer to that question.
It does resonate. I do think, I'm not at all disagreeing with that. I think that's incredibly true. But when it comes to the queer experience, I don't want to get like angry about the fact that you haven't asked these questions before, you haven't thought about it. That's not really helpful. And it's fine for us to talk about these experiences so that more people are aware of it, as long as the companies who are engaging in those types of things are also supporting charities and doing the right thing for queer people in general.
Yeah. And you know, to a large extent, there has been some progress made. Lots of large organisations, ours included, includes, you know, pronouns and the end of email signatures, and has that visibility at Pride events, and, you know, it sort of talks the talk and hopefully walks the walk as well when it comes to allyship. So that, is there some optimism that we're making progress, and acknowledging that there's obviously more to do?
In society in general, I don't know if I feel optimistic, but I do think it's always a bit 2 steps forwards, 1 step back. And we saw a similar rhetoric towards gay people in the 1980s, where newspapers were outwardly saying gas the gays to get rid of HIV. You know, Piers Morgan was writing about banning gay kisses on EastEnders and how everyone was indoctrinating children, and those exact same arguments are back again right now.
And I suppose back then, you know, in the 80s and 90s, as we discussed, there wasn't the platform for LGBTQ plus people to kind of fight back, as it were, or to showcase that empathy and showcase the challenges. So there is that bit more of a level playing field potentially, in terms of there are the platforms, there are fantastic podcasts out there which give
Thank you.
Yeah.
I also think that there are companies that are doing exceptionally well in this space. If you look at Disney and the way they finally got round to responding to Ron DeSantis in Florida, they've just pulled out of $1 billion investment in Florida because of their anti-gay laws, and to be honest, their anti-black laws. They ripped out black education. Black Lives Matter is banned from schools, I think. So is LGBTQ plus inclusive education. So Disney went, you know what, you're not having that money, and that's incredible, and we need more of that.
Okay, so we have some questions to wrap up. I think one of them was, do you have any advice for young people who are struggling right now to kind of come to terms with who they are?
If you're struggling, you haven't got the capacity to fight, and that's fine. So don't fight. Just take a second, recharge your battery, and let the rest of the community deal with it. That's why we're a community, and that's why we have allies. So if you're struggling, turn off the internet, take a minute.
And find somebody that you trust to talk to. I mean, I never did, and don't get me wrong, I didn't obviously struggle when I was a child, but as I talked about before, I'm sure it has had kind of lasting effects on who I am. But on this topic, and as we know on mental health more generally, if you can find someone to talk to. I mean, these things get so big in your own head, right? And it is a big issue, but it gets even bigger if you keep it in. So find someone and talk to them, and, you know, the old problem shared and all that.
Yeah. And do you think we'll ever get to a situation where coming out isn't a thing?
Look, it depends. In our lifetimes, no, I don't think so. But right, if you went back to if you went back to Alan Turing, which was what, the 40s, 50s, and then if you went back to Oscar Wilde, like, undeniably we are a million miles away from how those people were treated. And so it kind of depends what we're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, a human lifetime is not that long. I mean, it's too long for this, you know, on this topic. It should happen more quickly. But I don't know, like 100 years from now, can you imagine this still being the issue it is? I don't know. And to James's point, sometimes it is 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So I think it is peaking and troughing. To pick up on a couple of points James has made, you know, the UK has slipped from, I think, 1st place down to 15th or something in Europe for LGBT plus rights. And so whilst there are countries where, you know, it is unlivable for gay people, we need also not to forget that we are letting things slip here too.
Do you have any advice for businesses and managers who want to help people feel 100% themselves? I mean, I think you've touched on this, but...
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'd add to what I've already said on this topic, I was thinking about the term anti-racist, which has been talked about a lot, and I think there is an equivalent to that for the LGBT plus community. You know, I'm for obvious reasons, I do not hear anti-gay comments at Deloitte. I don't hear it. People wouldn't say it when I'm in the room, obviously. My plea to people, whether this is at Deloitte or in any big business or in any walk of life actually, is if you hear it, call it out. That is a huge difference that you can make, because just letting it slide or even just not laughing isn't really enough. I still fear it happens when people think they're in a so-called safe space and no one's going to have a problem with them saying it. So for me, a little bit along the lines of the anti-racism, being anti-homophobic as opposed to just not being homophobic can make a big difference.
Well, James and Mags, thank you so much for coming in today. I think we've already maybe dispelled this week's big question, but we can, you know, in a nutshell, in a tweet perhaps, could you answer the question, does being you get easier with age?
Right, well, I will go first this time, in the knowledge that James is going to disagree with me. I think it does. For me, I think it has been a combination of growing into myself, growing in confidence, but also coupled with, and again, I'm talking, you know, the course of my lifetime, coupled with societal change. Undeniably, and not to, you know, everything we've talked about today and all the points James has made, you know, I broadly agree with. Broadly. Damning with faint phrase. Undeniably, it is definitely easier for me to live my life now than it was. That's undeniably true. Not to minimise all of the struggles that there still are.
I broadly agree with Mags. I'm going to tell you about my nan. So my nan, who's no longer here, we were at a Harvester restaurant once, and it was like her birthday, and she didn't like the waiter. She said to the waiter, she called the waiter a cow shed because she liked cows, so she didn't want to use that word because it's offensive to call someone a cow to cows. So she called her a cow shed, and I was so confused by that because I must have been about 6 or 7, and she explained to me that as you get older, you don't really care what people think, and I think I've probably embodied some of that. So actually I would agree, yes, I think you do get to a point where you don't care as much, and probably in that sense it does get easier to be yourself with age.
And you probably don't care because you're more confident, presumably. Yeah,
I think you've just surrounded yourself with the people that you need to function. And yeah, you're more confident, and at the minute I guess we're in a country where we can get gay married, so things are slightly better, and hopefully they'll be continuing to do so, even if it doesn't feel like it at the minute. I tried to be positive.
That's a good,
sorry, I tried.
Optimistic note to end on, yeah.
Well, Mags, James, thank you so much for coming into the Green Room today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We'll be back next time with another big question. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad and is hosted by George Parrott, Lizzie Elston and Ethan Worth. Thanks to our creative studio for their technical support. Original music by Ali Barrett from our consulting team.